So let's make sure you go live.
Okay.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I see Chief Justice Rush.
Good.
So the
Thank
floor is
you.
yours.
Ready? Well, thank you for having the court. I have my colleagues. I don't know if you've met all of them. We just came out of an oral argument, so if I bring up drainage pipes in Montgomery County, I'll have been confusing my, my events. We thank you for taking the time to let the court present its budget. We have asked for some increases in two main areas. One is court technology, and the other is on public safety, some public safety programs. I have a couple handouts for you, just three. I did not bring PowerPoints this year. I brought three. One is on Indiana court technology, one is on problem-solving courts, and the other is dealing with the problem-solving courts in the pre-trial in commercial courts. So with court technology, what we're asking for is a fixed amount for court technology of $17 million. Currently, it's funded by $3 million of general fund funding, and then a reversion of filing fees that averages between $10 million a year and $14 million. And the reason that we're looking for a steady source of funding is just because of the different services that we're providing in court technology. Right now, you can go online. Has anyone not gone online to look up a case? 54 million people a year can go online for free and look at a case in Indiana. And there's a benefit to that. People don't have to leave work. They can just on their phones. We text messages. We've done 4 million text messages. And again, that deals with public safety to the extent that when people did not come to court, you have a failure to appear, and default, they get arrested and they go spend time in the local jail. So in looking what we're doing in court technology, we're now providing information on domestic violence with regard to firearms. We're providing information to the Department of Education on child abuse and neglect cases. So we have 400 entries where somebody has been employed in an educational setting that once they have that, then their legal department can look at it. The protective order registry has 1 million entries in it right now. We had 34 new protective orders last year. 2 decades ago, if a woman, and it's usually a woman, has a protective order, they'd have to carry the protective order around in their car. We now have the entity that you can go on. We have a guardianship registry now for endangered adults, and we have over 4,000 endangered adults. Their assets are listed in there, so if somebody shows up and you want to know if there's a guardianship and who you need to talk to, whether it's a medical provider or a financial provider, you can go and look at those assets that are there. We have risk assessments that are in there with regard to people that are in pretrial release, helping judges make decisions with regard to safety issues. The drug-related issues, methamphetamine, continues to just scourge our counties. And what you asked us to do several years ago is to take our court data and put it in a system. If you have a drug conviction, so that goes into a system that goes to the pharmacies each night. We have 90,000 names of people in Indiana that can no longer buy drug precursors and that. So the Indiana Court Technology Sheet really gives you a sampling of a lot of things directly related to public safety that we're doing. The child victim data, the drug-related criminal convictions, electronic traffic tickets. The court has taken on the entity. It used to be a police officer would have to sit at the side of the road and write a traffic ticket out. We now do it electronically. We have, I think we had 84,000 traffic tickets issued last year. So the funding that the courts generate, last year in 2021, the courts collected a total of $49 million. $33 million of that went back to the state general fund, $13 million went to county, and then another $3 million went to local funds. The court has not received an increase in any type of monetary budget since 2016 was the last time the court received an increase. We feel very strong about not asking for much and asking for what we do ask for is when we hit a need. In getting through COVID, court technology was key. We were able to keep courts operational by moving to a Zoom platform. We live stream court hearings. You could go on the Indiana Court website right now, and if you want to see how a court's doing or cases going on, you can find courts from around the state that are still doing the Zoom licenses. So the net increase that we're asking for court technology is $2.08 million. And a big part of the request for court technology comes out of something the legislature asked us to do in 2019. You asked us to chair and work throughout the state on a jail overcrowding task force. And in that jail overcrowding task force, the report that came back saying the problem we have is we've got 20 different systems working with jails. We don't have real-time jail data. So we're working with the Sheriff's Association with their cooperation, and we're building something called In Jail. And what that in jail will mean will allow real-time data sharing between jails and justice partners. It'll give information to the legislature with regard to decisions you want to make on criminal justice reform, and will follow somebody from arrest to the time they would be released from the DOC. We don't have that right now. If you want to say, what are we doing on pretrial? How many people are in pretrial on a driving while, how many people are in jail right now on a driving while suspended or possession of a syringe? We're not able to capture that information. And looking at the public safety elements that will come from the courts taking the court data that we have now that we have an integrated case management system, linking it with the jail system, and we can help build that. We received some initial grants from the Indiana Criminal Justice Institute. It'll cost us about $3 million a year. We're just folding that into our general request for court technology. I gave you a sheet that shows just cases. I wanted you to show that we have 2.5 million cases pending in Indiana, and it's on front and back, and you can look at the types of cases that are pending. So when you look at what the courts do, we had 40,000 protective orders. We had 50-some thousand divorces, some with children, some without children. The number of expungements we do, the number of evictions that are done, the number of protected adults that are involved in the system, and then the bottom line shows the amount of people, and we're just starting to capture that are unrepresented. That would be the pro se litigants. So in the front, you see the criminal offenses that we have pending, new filings and pending filings, and on the back, you can see the amount of CHINS cases, delinquency cases, guardianship, mortgage foreclosures, collection, and expungements. So we think that information will be helpful. But we're now able to collect all this type of information so you have it because of the investment you've done in helping us look at court technology. So those are requests for that. We want to continue to build. I met with Representative McNamara, and I met with individuals that say, do you think the court technology can do this? And there was a concern that they raised that what information can we provide to law enforcement before they go into a house which could potentially have a dangerous situation? Well, we can work with that. We have something called supervised release system where we're collecting all the information we can on an offender so that judge, that prosecutor, that public defender, all entities can have that to make a good decision with regard to particularly a low-risk nonviolent offender remaining in jail pending the outcome of their case. So those are the main requests, and probably the biggest thing that we're doing right now is on the in-jail, with that coming out of the jail overcrowding task force. So today we're actually meeting with the 50 new sheriffs. Our court technology team is meeting with the new sheriffs to present them with information on in jail, and that's just an acronym, IN jail. If you can think of a better name for the jail case management system, we're open to that. Court security, pretrial certification, and working with the state and local JRACs. In looking at how we continue to fund the court technology, with it being tied to a filing fee, it goes up and down. And when COVID hit, our cases went down, and it took our jail technology from 14.8 million to 9 to 10 million. It's hard to sustain a system when we're involved with working with the public defender system in writing theirs. When the legislature, I think it was 2 years ago, asked us to build the software for the administrative law judges, and we did that, and that's why we're asking for a stable source of funding. But again, the net amount of that by reverting it, and I have the amount on the letter you have on the back page of that, it shows the amount that could be reverted to the general fund each year based on filing fees, and that averages $2.5 million a year. The other main funding piece that we're asking for, well, there's two. One, commercial courts, which is part of specialty courts. And in 2014, when I became Chief Justice, one of the first things, I was reading an article, and it was the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that said, businesses look at the litigation environment of a state before they decide to locate or do business there, 70%. So I invited to the Supreme Court business leaders and companies from throughout the state of Indiana and filled the court and asked them, what are your opinions on the litigation environment of Indiana? And they said it takes too long and it's too expensive, and we want to have a level of predictability. So at that point, we decided that we were going to embark with them, and Senator Cook has been very involved with this, and actually Representative Washburn was before he left the House. We built a commercial court system. We now have 10, and there's a handout for you on that. We have 10 commercial court judges. We have had 1,600 cases filed through the commercial courts. It's working. I met with businesses at a program, it was about 2 months ago, and some of the general counsel said they're actually working Indiana's commercial courts into their contracts in lieu of arbitration, saying that it would work through the commercial court model. What we're doing with that is we have the decisions from the commercial court are written up. We don't do that with our trial court. They're searchable. If you want to find out what a commercial court in Elkhart did with regard to a covenant not to compete in Marion County, you can pull that up. When we go to law school, we hear about the Chancery Courts of Delaware, right? Talk about great courts for business, predictable, fast. You know, we really want to build that jurisprudence in Indiana, and the cost to continue the commercial courts are $500,000. Representative Jeter, Senator Glick, Senator Cook, I'm just saying some of the ones that have come to some of the presentations. We want to build that. We want businesses to be able to get their disputes. It's mostly contracts, it could be torts, decided quickly. And if you look at the commercial court handout, the average time on a restraining order or summary judgment isn't years, it's days and weeks. So the cost for doing that, we've been funding that in a funding stream that we're no longer going to run out of. It's $500,000 a year to have that transforming, complex business litigation. And those commercial court judges get extra training. They have extra resources with regard to staff on that. So we have the Chamber of Commerce supports it. We actually are becoming a national leader. Judge Welch is involved in that with regard to the amount of cases. We just increased the cases the courts from 6 to 10. You can file a commercial court case anywhere in Indiana. So it can take a county, like Tippecanoe County could have its case filed. You could file your commercial court case in Marion County, so long as the parties are agreeing with that particular venue. So that's the request for the commercial courts. And the final piece that we're looking for funding is for problem-solving courts. What we have found in Indiana, we have doubled our problem-solving courts in the last 8 years, is that they work. The cost for DOC, for somebody being in DOC, is $73 a day. For juvenile, it's $372 a day. And what we do is we take even moderate and some high-risk people that are ready to turn their lives around, keep them in the community, keep them with their job, keep them with their families. It takes a lot of court work, and that work is done, and they're able to assimilate. So if you look at the problem-solving handout that I gave you, it'll show you the counties that have problem-solving courts. We have about 30 counties that do not. We want to continue to grow that in lieu of just straight incarceration for people with substance abuse issues, but it's become an issue of justice by geography. If you get arrested on a meth charge in one county, you might be serving 12 to 16 years, but if you've got a veterans court or a drug court, you may be able to stay in your community. And the recidivism rates, with the last numbers that I looked at, it's like 85 to 90% of the people that successfully graduate from a problem-solving court do not reoffend. So significant savings there. And it causes the courts to the judges to get out from behind their benches and work with their local communities, with their law enforcement. And if any of you have ever been to a problem-solving court graduation, there's nothing like it. I just went to the 10th anniversary of the Floyd County Veterans Court. And what they did in Floyd County is they took Clark County, Floyd County, and Washington County. They combined it because some of these rural counties can't do it on their own, but they can do it with other counties. And they had a number of graduates. So we've maxed out our problem-solving capacity. Right now, the state's funding on problem-solving courts is $1 million, and it's for veterans courts. We're asking that to increase. We're also looking at mental health courts. The Behavioral Health Commission report noted that we needed to have more mental health courts, again, in lieu of incarceration in jails, and also family recovery courts that are in Chin's cases. When can children safely remain with their families as the family is going through recovery? They're working. We've had a high amount, and we're asking for funding for those courts. And then the final piece is civil legal aid. If you look at the bottom of the sheet, And we've just started collecting this, we're still working on the accuracy of the data, but you'll see significant amounts of people come to court unrepresented, some people can do that, some cases are fine. But we found in a study is that 80% of people living below the poverty line have at least one civil legal aid need that's keeping them from progressing. It could be they have an expungement, it could be a veteran trying to access benefits, it could be a grandparents trying to get custody of their children so they don't go into the CHIN system. And that's a community economic development issue, getting child support paid, getting your license back, getting your housing issues resolved. In 2007, the legislature gave the court for the first time $1 million for civil legal aid. That was in the 1990s. 2007, it was increased to $1.5 million, and there's not been any increases since. So we are asking for an increase in civil legal aid funding. We are not and have not in the last 8 years asked for funding for new positions, anything internally within the Supreme Court. We've really put all of our quest into sort of economic development, looking at court technology and the engine it can do. We are doing online dispute resolutions in 5 counties. Those are people that are able to do their whole case on their phone, not have to miss work. The Zoom hearings and the things that we're doing remotely allow people to, we're showing show-up rates are better. We're able to resolve a lot of cases that way. And then the other thing is the public safety. The data that we have from our court cases, the community safety issues with regard to somebody out on pretrial, the sharing of our information with you as our decision makers, with local law enforcement. We've really been walking step in step with our local sheriffs on the in jail and the data that we're providing so we can safely make decisions on dispositions for people that commit offenses. We all know when we read in the papers with regard to the increase of violence in our communities. And what information can we provide to sheriffs, law enforcement? What information can we share with regard to the millions of cases that we have before us? And just the sheer number of things that are available that we didn't have before. When I talked about 5.54 million people are going on my case, Indiana my case a year, thanks to the technology that helps provide to see their case. And I had legal services called me and said, people, before they hire a contractor, they may go online to look to see if they've had a bunch of lawsuits against them. The transparency level that we want to continue to bring to the judiciary is to continue. So that's roughly the request we're asking for. It comes out to about 7% of our operating fund. We're asking for an increase. And again, that would be the first increase since 2016. The judiciary is 1% of the budget. We've had a lot of turnover, not judges. A lot of judges retired. Probably a third of our judiciary is new in the last 3 years. So we're doing a lot of work with regard to training them. But the core of our budget that we're looking for, again, is the problem-solving courts and court technology. Any questions?
So let's go back to the 17 million. So you said currently you get court fees, and that is a range every year, and then you get a $3 million appropriation.
Correct.
So I think what I'm trying to decipher out of that is you want the fees to go into the general fund.
Correct.
And you want a guaranteed $17 million.
I do. Okay. And what we're looking at, the other fees that go to the state, there are other filing fees that go already to the state, which are $33 million, and that was last year. And that was actually a down year. Cases are ticking up this year. So it's, again, we're looking at the range, and the range has been from 10 million, I think the low of 10 million to a high of 14.5.
I was just trying to figure out how you want to do it. And then my second question is, I'm not a lawyer, so bear with me. So the commercial courts, is that disputes between corporations?
Yes. It's not, it could be an individual. They've got to agree, but it's mostly complex commercial disputes between corporations. It might be a case where you have to appoint a special master. It might be an injunction. It might be a shareholder disagreement. It might be a covenant not to compete. It'd be sophisticated business litigation, and that's why we're really paralleling, looking at states. And I'm really looking at Delaware. And I've just had a meeting with the Chief Justice from Delaware recently. I said, we're coming after you with regard to being a state with a strong business litigation environment.
Any questions? Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to your original discussion about the technology in terms of the domestic violence orders, the sex offender registry, and protective orders. So what you're doing with that is you're aggregating all of that data for law enforcement in particular to be able to have that, right?
Right. And then the guardianship data, so that we had banks that would contact us saying, listen, our banks are being rated by endangered adults by their family members who are drug-seeking behavior. But if you have a guardianship registry, these financial providers, doctors, they'll know that this person's under guardianship and these assets are protected.
But getting back to the other piece that I was talking about.
Public safety.
You are doing that now. That
Right.
that is not something that is, in the last few years, has been readily available to law enforcement.
No, every time we add something, it becomes readily available to law
Right,
enforcement.
and
But the
so we've
protective-
had that discussion in more recent sessions about what kind of data law enforcement is able to access, which they weren't able to on their own databases. You are aggregating all of this and providing this, which is really important. You want to know, I think an example I heard was, in the past, if I had a protective order against a dangerous X, I would have to carry the paper around with me to prove to law enforcement and anybody who would listen to me that they're violating, et cetera. Now, it's all going to be electronic. Not only can I share it with people at the school, whatever it is, but I can also share it. Law enforcement can readily access it. Therefore, if they're coming upon me, I'm the bad person now, in my car at night or coming to my home, et cetera, they'll have that information. They'll know if I'm a sex offender. They'll know if I'm a domestic violence abuse
Or if you
person,
had
right?
and plus mental health, if you have involuntary, we have had a huge surge of involuntary mental health commitments. That information is always already made available with regard to purchasing, to the FBI with regard to purchasing firearms.
Okay.
And there's 40,000 there, I think it's Mary's, or 40, I think there's 40,000 in that registry right now.
Okay, that is really great information that I think
And
our
then
law
that piece is
enforcement needs
missing
to
is
have.
that jail data. We don't have that jail data from the time of arrest through the jail to the time, we have once they hit the court, but once they go to the jail, the Jail Overcrowding Task Force, and I can make that report available, it's hyperlinked to the letter that I sent you. We can also send it electronically. That was the number one thing that they needed. We're missing the fact that we don't have this.
Right, obviously, if I'm incarcerated.
Right.
That's not an issue. But when I'm out, was I arrested? What was I arrested for? Was it for violating the protective order, or am I a dangerous person?
Right.
Was it an assault, et cetera? And I would like to be able to know that as a public safety officer. No, I think that's helpful. And then I want to go back to the business litigation. I just want to make sure this isn't about us encouraging commercial litigation in the state. And I think that's the point about Delaware. I mean, that's why so many corporations are incorporated there with their chancery court. They're highly sophisticated and skilled in this.
That's what
Because
we're looking at.
you don't want some unlearned judicial officer to make a decision that has significant consequences. And to your point is, as it's an economic development piece, as we move forward and try to attract major industries that are not here, they need to have the assurance, particularly as we're going into more sophisticated issues,
And we provide the training.
crypto, whatever you want to go through. We want to make sure that the judicial officers overseeing these cases actually have the wherewithal to understand how to do this.
And the staffing with regard to the timing, too. You don't want to wait 2 years to get a summary judgment order done. We're
Right,
looking at,
that's
and we're
expensive.
tracking that data with regard to it. And we're actually, a treatise is going to come out on Indiana commercial courts that attorneys can use with regard to best practices as well.
And so you're kind of downplaying some of this because the idea that your cases, then your results are searchable, that matters. So again, if I'm thinking of incorporating here and I understand that you understand trademark law better than other states, then I may be, and that's my business, and I'm all IT software and intellectual property, I'm going to look at this state a little more carefully because when you are incorporated somewhere, that's going to be the preferred venue if there's a dispute, and that matters. My last one is to do with these problem-solving courts. Allen County, with no help from me, has been at the forefront of having many problem-solving courts, which have worked. The drug-solving courts, veterans courts. So with respect to the family court, it's great that you intervene, you have wraparound services, so to speak, in my words, for these families that are stressed, but not chins. But the courts fund that, correct?
Right, they are chins. The family recovery courts are for chins.
But they're not going through the chins
Right.
process, so to speak,
Well,
right?
it's not going through the traditional chins process.
Yes.
It may be in lieu of foster care that they're dealing with with the Family Recovery Court. And it allows, when can a parent go through treatment at the same time keeping the child in their care? And when can you do it safely? So I think it speeds up the process, and you have that weekly court intervention, that accountability. So we can be we're the lever with regard to the accountability in dealing with the substance abuse.
But you don't receive any money from DCS
We
for this?
don't receive any money from
Even though
DCS.
in a sense you take this off their balance sheet, literally, figuratively, and physically, these are not children that then their people have a responsibility for, your people are taking care of them.
Well, they're in the family, you still have DCS case
Right, there's an
management
oversight, but not,
The DCS case management. We did have Doug Hunsinger and the governor actually gave us some SOAR money, so we did get $1 million from them the last couple of years, which has been our sole source of funding for the Family Recovery Court.
was that a one-time fee fund?
We've gotten it 3 years, I think we've gotten it 3 years, the last 3 years, we've gotten $1 million. We would not have any funding to get this off the ground. I am asking the DCS to look at a service standard, so we get a service standard for those family recovery courts, because they are evidence-based, the outcomes have been tremendous. If you've gone to, and I'm sure Senator Brown, you've been to a Veterans Court graduation, it's really tremendous to
Yes.
see how you take somebody that, you look at you're 10 years in jail and $400,000 of taxpayer money versus that time of that judge knowing that case, having them stand before them weekly, pairing them with the veteran support. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and they're not easy. I mean,
Yeah.
I've heard law enforcement or
And we've
judicial
doubled-
say they'd rather not go through it, some of the problem solving, because it is difficult, but the success rate and recidivism rate's a
And
lot
we've
better.
doubled. And if you look at the map in Indiana on the share, you'll see that there are pockets of Indiana we don't have it. We really want to make sure that we have that available in lieu of long-term time. And, here's the map. Here are the counties that don't have them. Here's what we had, 10 years ago. We want to make sure that it's available, and just a safety valve, so people can stay in their communities, they can continue to earn income, support their kids, and not be in DOC.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Chair.
Senator Condora.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chief Justice, thank you for your service. I appreciate you and all the justices and your entire team. I have a couple of questions that have finance and public policy implications. I served as a former city controller for Indianapolis. I dealt with the criminal justice system, the jail overcrowding issue, the technology issue, so I've seen the impact of that level of collaboration between the locals and the Supreme Court and its impact on the locals. So I appreciate hearing that you're working on the jail overcrowding task force and the technology piece. That's significant. My questions relate to a couple of things. Looking at the budget report that you submitted, the guardian ad litem line item is not changed. It's maintained at status quo. I know when I was at the city, Marion County alone spent more than $9 million a year on guardian ad litem. And when I was a city controller, we approached the state at that time and we said we need more funding. And there was some more finger pointing saying, well, the Supreme Court is going to ask the Budget Committee and the General Assembly for more funding. And the General Assembly said, well, the Supreme Court did not ask for more funding. So I know for a fact that the $6 million or $7 million is not sufficient to take care of the guardian ad litem across the state of Indiana for all the cases that we're working on. Any thoughts on why that line item is flat in your proposed budget?
Well, it doubled. In 2014 and 2016, the legislature doubled our guardian ad litem fees. So we've got guardian ad litem programs in 88 counties. Limited resources. I mean, in working with Marion County, and they do get the lion's share on the guardian ad litem fees. And there's room for increase in everything that we have. But I mean, I think we try to stretch it. We try to stretch it, that money, as far as we can. But there's always an extra need for that. And there's a lot of legislation with regard to getting an attorney and a guardian ad litem for the children, and there'd be an additional expense with that. I do think, though, in the last 10 years, with doubling the amount, I mean, I think the legislature was very generous with regard to doubling the amount. And I think that would be something that we'd probably be asking for an increase in the future. But I'm always mindful of, we've got that double 10 years ago. let's do the best we can with that amount that we have, make it go as far as we can, and then work with Marion County. We did have 23,000 children last year, represented by 4,000 volunteers. It's a pretty phenomenal program, and they're donating all their time. So I think we have a strong CASA program. We have a strong cadre of, I was a guardian ad litem CASA to 100 kids when I was a practitioner on that, and we depend on those volunteers. I think in some counties, they pay their guardian ad litems and CASA, and that's where it's hard. So maybe they don't have the volunteer base. So we continue to work with them on that volunteer base. We have a VASIA program for endangered adults, which we've replicated for CASA. We have 40,000 reports of violence against endangered adults. So we now have, and I think we have 600 volunteers that we run the programs where they actually work with that endangered adult like they work with the CASA. So there's always funding needs, but I know I can't come to the well all the time.
I sincerely appreciate you, and I know and I think that we have shared interest in serving our kids across the state of Indiana. And I know that if this line item, for example, hypothetically was $25 million rather than $7 million, maybe that might not fully cover all the needs across the state, but I think the cost-benefit analysis should also include the congestion of the judicial system dealing with these cases. And if we were able to provide a little bit more funding, we might see cost savings through the expedited processing of those cases. And but I know factually, I know that we in Marion County, when I was a city controller, we spent north of $9 million as one county per year. And I know that that line item is not sufficient or anywhere close to where it needs to be at. The second question that I have is in relation to a couple of policy issues that impact fiscals. I appreciate Senator Brown asked about protective orders. I have more of a policy question. Before the Budget Committee meeting yesterday, a victim of domestic violence met with me in my office, and she had a protective order. And if you recall, there was a case in Indianapolis where a mother was killed at a daycare even though she had a protective order. A piece of paper does not protect people from abusers. And I don't have an answer to that. But from a judicial system perspective, have your team looked at any policy proposals that you recommend that we may think through as policy solutions that can provide more protections for victims of domestic violence?
There's a lot of work being done at the local level with regard to evidence-based programs for the offenders. But all of the programs, Senator, kind of blend. You know, a lot of these people aren't just needing a CASA. They're in the problem-solving courts. They're in the veterans courts. They're dealing with mental health. The criminal justice system is the #1 referral source to get people substance abuse treatment. Go figure, right? That it's us. So we've got to train our judge. All these families are intertwined. They're not, they may have a mental health crisis. They come into court on a resisting arrest. So trying to deal with these families, with these different entities, and then our job is with regard to dealing with the offender before us and making sure that data's there, that law enforcement can pull it up. But the increase in violence that we're seeing in courts right now is correct. If you look at the numbers with regard to the protective orders and the domestic violence cases, they're sky high right now. For a policy, how do you fix that? You know, we want to make sure the courts do their part. Once, you know, we're reactionary. The cases has already happened when it comes to us. The Mental Health Summit talked about moving upstream. So I think dealing with the mental health and 988 rolling out will provide some answers to those. But it's very intertwined.
I appreciate, and I'll be respectful of the chairman's management of our time, so I'll ask one final question. The issue of firearms. So there's the IUPUI Policy Center published some data, I think it was either last year or the year before, that the cost to the judicial system for every homicide ranges anywhere between $250,000 to $500,000 depending on the case. And if it's a capital murder type of case, it can be in the millions. My question to you, in light of the permitless carry legislation that passed and in light of other things, from the judicial branch, there's a crisis. It's a public health crisis. Every single day in our country, 375 people get shot by firearms. 106 individuals die from the 375 people on a daily basis across the nation. So this is a problem for us in Indiana. Again, we are the legislature. We come up with laws and policies. but you mentioned firearms in your presentation, and I wonder if there are any policy recommendations from the judicial branch to us to consider. I see a financial impact of these policies, as I cited earlier, some statistics about the cost of these cases to the judicial system. Do you have any thoughts on what can we do better, one, from a public safety perspective, but two, also to be more fiscally responsible with our dollars as it relates to this policy area?
So very respectfully, Senator, very mindful of what the role is of the judicial
Correct.
branch. Our job is to enforce the laws
Correct.
that you make. And then when you ask us to do things like, will you capture these involuntary mental health commitments and send those to the FBI so that we will do that. Will you make sure this information is available here? You've got a tough, I've got my job. I understand, we're very mindful. My colleagues were very mindful of the lane we're in. The work that we're doing with regard to better response to mental health diversions, mental health diversions with the court, because those are the entities that hit the court. But we're very, we stay in our lane.
No, I appreciate, I just thought that there could be shared lessons from the judicial branch with us. I just want to conclude with thanking you on something that I hope that you can continue to invest in under your leadership. You led the initiative over the last couple of years on evictions, and there was a task force on evictions. We still have a crisis of evictions across the state. I know that the presiding judge over that task force mentioned to me that the task force, I think, sunset its work, or at least it paused its work. So I hope that you can continue to push for looking at that issue. We do have a crisis of evictions. It's not going anywhere. And it will continue to create issues. And on a local level in townships, township courts, there are inconsistencies across the state of Indiana on how judges deal with the time frame between an eviction notice and eviction hearing, and then the legal representation for folks. So I felt that the task force that you helped establish was helpful, and I hope that you can continue to invest in that direction. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions? So I think what I heard you say is we set policy and you have to deal with it, right? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have the Adjutant General, Colonel Eakin. I guess I should say Adjutant General's office since you aren't the Adjutant General. Whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. I am Colonel Kathy Eakin, and I am here on behalf of General Lyles today. Unfortunately, he was not able to make it today. He's in Slovakia on a visit overseas. So on behalf of the Adjutant General Office, I do want to talk about what our ask is for the biennium request. Our mission, and you should have these slides in front of you, but our mission in the Indiana National Guard is to basically, it's pretty basic. It's to fight and win America's wars at home and abroad, of course, whatever those wars may be, and to also serve the Hoosier state. Okay, thank you. So what we've done in the past, and I'll just hit some of these highlights, from 2020 to 2022, we have a total of just under 8,000 soldiers and airmen across the Indiana National Guard who have provided support for civil support response, also for overseas deployments, and then of course for COVID-19 support operations. And you can see those numbers there, and those photos show many different types of activities, from capital response to state active duty for snow emergency and ice on the roads and so forth. But of course, we have to be able to deploy quickly, and that goes into why we have to ask for, why we need to ask for the dollars that we do to modernize our facilities. So moving on to slide 4, for the modernization portion of this, I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence here as far as what an armory is, but I do want to cover that because sometimes it does sound like a mystery to some people. So I just want to cover that for everybody's edification. So we do use armories as a public safety hub at times. We use it for COVID operations. We use them for staging bases, Red Cross support, community requests, whether they need to use to rent the armory and so forth. But the point here is that we can use it for a public safety hub and to be able to stage for state and overseas operations. We also use that space to secure sensitive items such as weapons, communications devices, and so forth. We also use it as a space for drill, which is training. We call it drill. When somebody says they have to go to a drill, that's their weekend training or maybe even their annual training that's 15 days long typically. They also serve as recruiting centers, so it's very important that they are modernized and they are places that people want to come to. And I'll show some photos of that later, some of the differences that have been made throughout the years. Can I ask for any questions at this time as far as what other activities an armory may support? I just want to address that if anybody has any questions on that right now.
I'm wanting you to just finish your presentation. We'll
sounds
just
good.
ask questions at the end. Thank you.
Okay. So why are capital improvements needed? So that's a big question, right? So we do have backlog repairs. Our armories are an average of 57 years old at this time, and we have $143 million worth of backlog repair costs, maintenance and repair costs. We do have disrepair that does force units to relocate and relocate quickly. One of those examples is the Marion Armory, which is located just east of Kokomo and just west of I-69. We had to move this facility, the personnel in this facility, to Huntington because of the disrepair of the Marion Armory. They don't meet the current code requirements. Sorry, should I wait? Okay, they don't meet the current code requirements in many situations for as far as ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, National Fire Protection, and EPA regulations. And then, of course, they don't reflect the demographics of what the Indiana National Guard has now. So back in the day, 1950s, you know, of course, we just didn't have a lot of females in. And I'll tell you that Kokomo National Guard, or Kokomo Armory, does not have facilities for female soldiers. So that is, I'm also a brigade commander at the Kokomo Armory at 38th Sustainment Brigade. And I will tell you that when I started my full-time career there 22 years ago, the facilities look identical, to include the conduit that my team put in 22 plus years ago. So that's the state of our armories right now. Some of them. We do have current and future force structure requirements that do change over time. For example, 20 years ago, there was no such thing as a cyber battalion, and we have a cyber battalion now. The requirements for a field artillery unit are very much different than those of a cyber unit. And so as the demographics within Indiana change and the recruitable populations change throughout time, we need to be able to change with that. And we also have to be able to nest the needs of our changing Army with that as well. So the condition of our armories are negatively impacting our recruiting efforts. And again, I'll show you some photos here in a little bit. But I will tell you that there are some armories that I would not even think to take a 20-year-old into, much less a 17-year-old into, because of the state of disrepair that it's in, because it's not something that we're proud of, right? It's not something that we want to show off as, hey, you want to be part of this organization. So why do we need to have soldiers keep coming to drill and so forth and joining the military? It's due to the evolving threats and the response that we need to be able to provide to the state of Indiana. We do have foreign adversaries, of course. We do have units, like I said, that need to be able to respond within 48 hours for state emergencies. And also we have units throughout the state that are on call within 30 days to be able to deploy overseas. So they need to be modern enough to be able for us to do our job, right? Of course, supporting natural disasters, pandemics, and civil unrest. And we really do need to recruit the best for our missions, right? We want to recruit the right type of people to be able to stay in the Guard and also to be able to respond to these threats as needed. So our 20-year plan, it's to consolidate and divest of 31 facilities to other state or local agencies, which means a 45% reduction in the number of facilities. This will also reduce the maintenance costs, right? So we also want to maintain the 38 legacy facilities, create 5 new facilities, which would result in 43 modern facilities. And of course, we want to be able to sustain the funding to be able to support maintenance needs. For that modernization, the capital investment strategy for phase 1, you'll see fiscal year 23 through 28 here, but I want to focus on fiscal years 24 and 25 there. Number 1, the Danville Armory, which is scheduled for FY22. We did start the interior demolition in October, and we expect a completion date 12 months later here in October 2023. Martinsville is scheduled for FY23. It is currently fully designed, and we are waiting receipt of funding. And of course, there was a CRA impact that we're waiting for that CRA to be lifted come 16 December. And then third, Hamilton County Armory, the design is 75% complete, and we are anticipating contract of that award in summer of 2023 with a completion date around about 2025. Moving on to the next slide, which is the AGO FY24-25 budget, the biennial budget request. You'll see those numbers there listed in the blue box. And what's different about those numbers in the blue box is that they include the statewide preventative maintenance and repair and rehabilitation, sometimes called R&R at this point, right? So there's 5 of those items here: Hamilton, Columbus, Bloomington, LaPorte, and Vincennes. Those 5 armories for fiscal year 24 to 25 at a cost of approximately $28 million. What's different about that in compared to those that aren't highlighted and don't have the blue box around them is that doesn't include, like I said, the prev maintenance and the R&R. The federal framework commitment to modernization, just as a reminder, the cost share for rehab and repair is 50-50. For preventative maintenance is 50-50 as well. And then for new construction, it's 75% federal and 25% state. The expected cost is that every 5 to 7 years we'll spend $20 million for that new construction. So again, why is it important? Investment in public health, of course, health and safety, to be able to respond quickly to state and federal missions overseas and here in the Hoosier State, and support readiness and preparedness. And like I said, to be able to adjust to the changing needs of Army modernization, not just armory modernization, but Army modernization, where the Army continues to change its units to support the emerging threat globally. And then also to provide quality facilities to our service members and their families. So I want to use Bluffton as an example. It was originally built in 1955 at approximately 12,000 square feet. It was modernized and expanded in 2020 for just over $3 million, of course. And that modernization effort included over 2,200 square feet of renovations and additions. And you can see the items that were changed there. So everything from latrines to kitchen and so forth. So looking at the before pictures on the left-hand side, you'll see that that's a kitchen that I don't think any soldier would be real proud to cook in. Now on the right-hand side, you'll see one that's very, very much spacious. It's not fancy, it's not over the top, but it's basic enough for soldiers to be able to cook and to follow the hygiene requirements that are necessary for our 92 Gulfs or our cooks, Army cooks. Moving on to more examples here on the left-hand side, and I want to call out that photo on the very lower left-hand side. I wish we made that a little bit bigger for people like me with the eyesight issues here. So you'll see that was 2 years ago. So those restrooms, right? So there's a time and place for everything, and soldiers don't need to train to be miserable, I'll tell you that. But if any prospective soldier walked into an armory that looked like that, I'm pretty sure they'd turn right back around and leave. So thank God it doesn't look like that anymore. And on the right-hand side, you can see the updated and modernized bathroom facilities and so forth. Again, not over the top, but it meets the needs of what the expected 17 to 22-year-old soldier or potential soldier is going to walk into, of course. Here's more photos too. Again, this is just 2 years ago, and I'd like to say that this is the only armory that looks like this at this point. Marion, like I said, we had to move soldiers out of that armory because it looked even worse than this. And for safety reasons, we wanted to make sure that people were not being exposed to things that could, potentially not be so great for them. But again, this is a modernization effort win and an example of what we're looking to do. Not over the top, but it does provide for physical fitness training. It does provide for training space, classroom space, and office space. So this is really what we're going for here, is an update of our current facilities that are the ones that we want to maintain within the Indiana National Guard footprint. So with that, that is all I have for today, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
All right, Colonel. So first question I have is how many armories do we have throughout the state?
62 armories.
And you want to cut that down to 31?
No, so we want to cut that down. Let me get back to my number here, make sure we're good. Say again? To 43.
You want to take away 31?
So we want to divest of 31.
Okay.
We want to keep 43 of the 62, and then we want to build 5 more.
And how are you determining that? Is it just geographic area, kind of?
So there's a lot of things that go into that, right? So there's the recruitable population, the needs of the unit that needs to go in there. So I'll use Hamilton as a very good example. So right now, the 38th Sustainment Brigade is housed in Kokomo. That unit is split between their supporting element, their supporting battalion that is located in Huntington right now. Like I said, they had to move from Marion. And then we also have a communications team that should be co-located with them that's in Elwood right now. So that would take, once we build the Hamilton Armory, that will consolidate all of those elements, and that headquarters will be whole again instead of splitting up and training at 3 different locations.
And then you said that there's 143 million in backlogged repairs. This is what we're having our side conversation about. So I know about the match. So is it fair to estimate then that 74 million of that would be a state piece, and then 74 be, if it's a 50-50 match, your one page says that R&R is a 50-50 match with the
Yes.
federal government? So
Yes.
for us, I look at that as 74 million, right?
Yes, if that's the math. Sorry.
And then the last question I have is page 9. So in that previous page, you said something about capital investment of 20 million every 7 years. So I was a little confused. I look at this chart over the period of 6 years. You have the federal share as $121 million for all these projects. But yet on the one page, it says 20 million over 5 to 7 years.
Right, so that is an estimate, of course, and we did get, we were struck with some increases in material and so forth, and again, it's just an estimate.
All right. Any questions?
Yes.
All right. Oh, Representative Delaney.
Yeah. Have you given any thought to selling some of the excess facilities to the private sector rather than transferring them to local governments?
So that would have to go through the state process, of course, and if the state wanted to do that, then they could certainly do that. And we don't do that directly, we have to work through the state to do that.
Okay, thank you. And recruiting, what can we do to help you with recruiting? Because that's critical to your mission.
So I think part of it is changing the narrative. So we have a recruitable population right now who's grown up hearing about the Wounded Warrior project and so forth. Great project, right? So many, and I'm not endorsing that. I'm saying that there are many things out there with regards to the last 2 to 3 decades worth of war that have happened that I think are somewhat negatively impacting us, right? And so we need to change the face of the Indiana National Guard, and the Department of the Army is having the same problems with recruiting as well, right? So it's not just us. Also the facilities, that's one of the things, right? So improving the facilities. I would never take, so my stepdaughter is in the National Guard, right? I would never take her to that armory to try to sell her to join the National Guard. So part of that is modernizing those facilities. And to be able to retain these people, we need to do the same thing. Because we don't want to sell a good product and then turn around and put them somewhere, we don't want to do the bait and switch, right? So that's something that I think that the state of Indiana can help us with.
Lastly, I've read that up to 75%, maybe 74% of the young people are not really eligible for service in the military, either because of a drug problem, a criminal problem, a health problem. What's your estimate as to what percentage of our people between like 18 and 35 are ineligible to serve in your unit because of these conditions?
So I don't really have the numbers on that specifically for me. I will tell you that when our personnel director does brief the Adjutant General, General Lyles, the numbers are less and less every time, right? And it's because of everything you just said. So if somebody went to family therapy when they were 12 because their family was getting, their parents were getting a divorce, they have to go through and get documentation from those doctors to make sure that they are cleared. Sometimes that eligible candidate to join the military, they just lose interest because it's such a lengthy process. And that's not anything that the Indiana National Guard can fix or that the state of Indiana can fix. That's a Department of the Army thing that they know, they recognize this and they understand. But we also want to make sure, like I said, that we are hiring and selecting quality individuals to be able to join our forces and not add more stressors to them, of course.
Thank you, Colonel.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have IMPERS, Steve Russo.
You. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Steve Russo. I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Public Retirement System. Pleasure to be with you here today. Before I get started, I just want to also give a special thanks to the support staffs at both the Senate and the House and the State Budget Agency. We really appreciate and treasure the ongoing sharing of information that we have. And if there's anything that we could ever do to help better serve your needs, please let us know. So with that, we're going to jump right into it and do what I can to keep you on time. This first slide is just a summary and a reminder of we have now 16 different separate and distinct funds that we manage over at the retirement system. As of June 30 of last year, the total net assets of all those funds was $42.4 billion. We serve the needs of now over 500,000 members and 1,300 employers across the state. Given that this is the budget committee today will be a bunch of numbers, but just a reminder that also just as important what we do at IMPERS is not managing the money and the numbers, but it's taking care of people. But given the subject for today, you're just going to see a lot of numbers. So if I could only have one slide to give to you today, it would be this slide here in front of you now. This is a look back at our last fiscal year. But overall, our aggregate funded status across all of our plans, and even including the teacher pre-96, increased in the fiscal year from 71.9% to 74.8%. When you break that down, historically, we've talked about what we call our pre-funded plans. Those are almost all the plans except for the teacher pre-96. Those are designed that as people work, contributions are made as a percentage of their payroll to go towards and fund their retirement benefit when they become eligible for retirement. So by the very nature of those are funded and intended to be funded as people work, and when life and all the stars align in the pension universe, the funded status of those plans wants to be 100%. That means that as of that date, you have all the money in the bank as of that day to cover all of the liabilities that have been accrued in the plan as of that day. So it's effectively saying if the plan were to end that day, there's enough money in the bank to cover everything that's been promised out into the future. Now, a lot of people will say out there that the magic number for a healthy pension system is in the 80% range. I still try, after 15 years, looking for the person who came up with that number. I haven't found them yet, but as you look and do the math and talk to the experts in all of this, 80% seems to be a reasonable number. I've seen once you kind of get down into the 60s, things get a little bit dicey in that there's a very low likelihood that you're ever going to invest your way out of that funding scenario. So when you go back and look at what happened last year for our pre-funded plans, in the aggregate across all of them, the funding status went up. And however, that was even though we had a negative investment return for that year. But if you remember your actuarial science, the way the actuaries do the math, they take our investment returns and they smooth them over a 5-year time period. And so it's that 5-year average that really, I'll call it, matters when it comes to the math that the actuaries do to calculate funded status and ultimately what employers need to pay into the system. So we had a marvelous year prior with close to a 26% return and some other years. So in the end, when everything got shaken out with that 5-year smoothing, that 5-year smooth rate of return was closer to over 7%, which is above our target of 6.25. So from an actuarial perspective, we had actually a headwind of investment returns that helped us in our funding status. Now, there's a little bit of tailwinds that I'll talk about here in a few moments, primarily driven by inflation and what's happening with members' wages. From a contribution rate perspective, the good news is that for the most part across the board, contribution rates will remain flat, except for one notable exception, and that is the 77 fund. The 77 fund currently has a rate that's being paid today of 18%. Actually, that will go into effect January 1st. But that will now go up to 19.1% in January of 2024, and that is driven primarily by higher than expected salary increases for that year. And then when it comes to the teacher pre-96 plan, that's one where there's been a lot of great activity where the funded status has increased from 31.7% up to 37.5. I'll have some slides later that show the trajectory and the expected path of that over time. That does not include the funded status as of June 30 last year, includes a prior $600 million incremental contribution that we received the year before, $545 million that we received in the last fiscal year. So that's what's baked into the funded status that you see here. What is not baked in, because again, these numbers are as of June 30 of this last year, but we did receive an incremental $2.5 billion from the state that we received in October and is now in our assets and being put to work in the investment markets. However, there's a reminder, right, that plan still has $8.8 billion of unfunded liabilities associated with that. This slide just attempts to give kind of a simple explanation of the ins and outs of what happens in a year. There's some numbers in here that are pretty stable over time and some fluctuate greatly. But essentially, we had started the year with $45.8 billion, collected $2.7 billion of contributions. That's a total from both the state and local units of government. That is more in line with what I call our traditional flow of contributions. That second bar is the additional $545 million that we brought in to bring total revenue in for the year at $3.2 billion. But in the year-to-date loss in the investment portfolio was a negative $3.3 billion. And then we had payments go out the door of $3.3 billion to take us to $42.4 billion at the end of the fiscal year. I did check as of today, right, so this is going back to June. The markets have been very up and down since July 1st. We are now, I'll call it break even as of the end of November. November was, just to give you a feel for how things can change one month to the next. Going into November, we were about 5% down in our investments. And given the size of our assets, that's about $2 billion. But then the month of November reversed that and gave us our 5% back and brought us back up again. So to me, if nothing else, right, this goes to show the magnitude of once you have this amount of money, of assets being deployed, how the investment returns, and even just from one month to the next, or even from one day to the next, can change the numbers. But as a reminder, we are long-term investors and look at this over the long haul, which is baked into how the actuaries look at this. This slide just attempts to do a walk of the unfunded liability from where we had started last year to where we ended. And essentially what you see here is that our total UAAL, which is an actuarial term of unfunded actuarial accrued liability, we had started the year with a little over $13 billion in unfunded liabilities. Actually, we started the year with closer to 13.5. We expect that because of what we do, that the unfunded liability will go down each year. And so that when you bake that in, that's what took us down to expect to end the year at $13 billion. But due to what I talked about with the investment return and the asset smoothing, and along with our funding policy that in some funds brings in a little bit of extra money than the actuaries require, that helped offset about $400 million in unexpected demographic loss, which is a fancy way of saying that's, for the most part, the impact of unexpected salary increases that showed up in the plan that year. Now, maybe address it later, but in case the question comes up now, if you're asking, well, what does this mean long-term? And in the simple words, I would say short-term unexpected salary increases are not material to the long-term math of the plan. However, if you were to see these kind of increases continue year over year for a significant amount of time, that would have a material impact. But as of this point, we're not expecting or anticipate or assuming that the level of salary increases taking place in wages across our membership is going to continue year in and year out going forward. The next slide is another eye chart that breaks down the funded status by each of the different plans that we manage at NPERS. I will just note here that for the most part, all of the funds except two had an increase in their funded status, but there were two that had a slight decrease, that being the Teacher 96 plan and the 77 fund. And the reason for that is because of the way that these are funded, and I'll have another slide here in a moment that'll hopefully make it easier to see this, is that those funds today have contribution rates where there's no cushion to what's being provided, right? So we have this funding policy that keeps our contribution rate steady until certain things happen, and it's only when those things happen that the contribution rates will go up and down. Those two plans have already gone through phases where they have absorbed the cushion that was in them, and then anything that happens one way or the other is going to move their contribution rates up. And so because of that, those two plans driven by the salary component saw a slight decrease in their funded status. All the other plans had enough of the cushion that was collected along with the investment returns to offset that. This next slide is an aggregate view of how we project the funded status and aggregate of our plans. We had lived for a long time here in the state of Indiana in an aggregate basis, including teacher pre-96, of being in the middle 60s in funded status. And thanks to some efforts to help bolster the teacher pre-96 plan, that number is now at 74.9. And you can see the march that we are projected to make towards getting to 100% funded across an aggregate all of our plans. I will say that what is baked into what you see here and all of our projections for teacher pre-96 includes the 2.5 that we received. However, it does not include the incremental $1 billion that is currently slated to come to us if there's excess reserves at the end of this fiscal year. So that is excluded from these projections. Just FYI, I'll wait and get there on what that means of that billion. This next slide is, if nothing else, a reminder of between state and local units of government, kind of who owns the liabilities and where the money's coming from. And for me, at least, this is insightful as a reminder that on the liability side, local units of government now own a majority share of the liabilities. They're all called, it's like a 60-40. 60% is local units, which includes schools, 40% the state. Now, when you look at the other side of the page, that is a pie chart of the money that came in last year, and it's kind of the flip side. 60% of our revenue came from state and 40% from locals, and that's primarily driven by that dynamic of the teacher pre-96, right? As time goes by, the state's obligation for the teacher pre-96 is going to decrease. And that will be then picked up by schools as teachers in the new plan are part of that plan. So if nothing else, again, a reminder of if and when there are issues that come before the state General Assembly when it comes to pension benefits, just a reminder that many of the decisions you're making have a proportionally higher impact to local units of government than it does to the state or the general fund. Won't spend much time here. Again, looking at the money that we brought in through last fiscal year. I'd mentioned that we have this funding policy that we put in place a number of years ago. Happy to report that our funding policy was nationally recognized as a model practice. Believe it or not, there was a funding policy contest that took place nationally amongst the actuarial community, and our funding policy was selected as an innovative approach to properly funding a pension plan while also taking care of the needs of our employers to try to bring some stability to the contribution rates they pay in. This slide is a summary then of the contribution rates for those plans that have a rate established by the board that is funded as a percent of payroll as people work. You'll see two colors here, blue and at least what I'm going to call an orange. The blue represents what's called the ADC. That's what the actuaries calculate. That includes a surcharge for the supplemental reserve accounts that I'll talk about here in a moment. And then the orange represents the portion of that rate that is, I'll call it that cushion, that's driven by our funding policy, where in some plans we know they collect a little more now to try to smooth out volatility in the rate that employers have to pay. And again, here you will see for the Teacher 96 plan and the 77 fund, that cushion is gone. So that rate will now move up as the actuaries calculate what that rate needs to be. Looking at investments over the last year, already highlighted much of this. We experienced a negative 6.6 return in our investments for the last fiscal year, but smoothed over 5-year period. That is a 7.1% number, which is above our 6.25% assumed target going forward. That remains one of the most, some will say conservative. I always say it's the most realistic. That's out there amongst many of our peers across the country. This next slide is just a reminder of what we manage at NPERS. There's, of the 42-ish that we have in assets, 36 are in defined benefit accounts by which we at NPERS are responsible for the investment of those assets. However, there's another $6 billion that are in defined contribution accounts where we provide options for the members to select how they want that money invested for their retirement future. This is a picture of our current asset allocation for our defined benefit plan that's established by the board. We believe it to have been and continue to be a very diversified portfolio. We at NPERS don't pretend to be able to predict exactly what's going to happen from one day, 1 week, or even 1 year to the next. We look at everything from a balanced approach of looking at all scenarios and try to pick an asset allocation that delivers that 6.25 that we target to get, but also looks to balance out the rides along the road that happen as certain economic and financial market conditions play out. This slide is a reminder of where we've been through time. Some of us were in a room similar to this back in 2008. I had just come on the job and had to explain where almost half of our assets went to back in the 2008 financial crisis. And so you can see since we've dug out of that, the markets have been kind. And I'll also say one thing that has historically been the trend over the last 10 years that we don't expect to continue is that over the last 10 years, not only were the markets somewhat favorable, particularly in traditional stocks and bonds, but they were very historically less volatile. But what we've seen now is a return of what I would call normal historical levels of volatility coming into the market. But for many people that only just remember the last 10 years, they may not remember that what normal volatility might look like. This next slide shows, I'll call it that traditional view of our investment performance over a 1, 3, 5, and 10-year period. We compare what our actual return is, which is what is in the blue, and then in the orange/yellow is what's called a benchmark. And that benchmark does not represent, well, our peers or anything like that. It represents if we had taken our board-approved asset allocation and went strictly passive. We didn't make any decisions about underweighting or overweighting any asset class, and we didn't pick above average managers and managing our money. That's what the return would have been. So essentially this measures the incremental level of return that our team generated by doing their jobs right, picking the right managers, and the board allows some discretion to overweight and underweight slightly some of the asset classes. And so that's the net result of that. So happy to report that our investment team continues to deliver incremental value to the state of Indiana. The next couple slides highlight that going back now, I forget how many years it's been, as many of you know, there was and continues to be a big debate in the public pension world about defined benefit versus defined contribution. And in the state of Indiana, the policy has migrated towards maintaining our defined benefit, hybrid defined contribution approach, but allowing new hires the ability to decide what's best for them and to choose accordingly. And so today we have the ability, right, for employees, and depending upon what their employers decided, to have a choice in what they want their retirement to be. So for our public, in PERF, for the public employees, local units of government in Indiana, in my opinion, are given unlimited flexibility on what they want to do for their employees, because they can decide whether they want to offer one or the other, or a choice, or not at all for their new hires. And so we have currently 42 employers in the local unit space that allow their employees to participate and opt into a My Choice program. This slide shows the membership of the people choosing that over time. It's growing. Also in the yellow at the bottom, you'll see the element of the Turf My Choice that came on later. We're now newly hired teachers have a choice of what to do. Just saw some numbers last night, actually, that somewhat surprised me. That seemed to indicate that of those who have a choice between DB, the hybrid, and just DC only, 20% of new hires are choosing the defined contribution only. I honestly thought going into seeing those numbers, I was going to see something closer to about half of that, high single digits, 10, but it's 20%. This slide, take a few moments to talk about the Teacher Pre-96 plan, because that is the biggest component of the state budget in terms of what is requested from the general fund. So this is a bar chart that shows the balances of what used to be called the Pension Stabilization Fund for the Teacher Pre-96. And you can see the incremental impact in red of the extra contributions that have been made to that, and how we expect to see the balances of that pension stabilization grow, which then is a lead into this chart that some of you may be familiar with. We call it the hump chart. The red represents annually the expected amount of benefits going out the door for that plan. We're getting close to peaking, by the way, in the annual amount of benefits going out in that plan. The blue represents how much has been appropriated from the state to cover that red portion. By design, we had historically been in a period where we were dipping into the Pension Stabilization Fund to cover all of the benefits, but that was by design. When this program was first put in place back in the mid-90s, there was some foresight of seeing baby boomers coming down the road and knowing that we need to put money in the bank now to soften the blow of the baby boomer, so that we have a predictable, stable growth of appropriations that need to come from the state to support this plan. And so I would say, the plan worked and worked during that time period. There was assets in that plan to cover those shortfalls. But since now what you'll see is, right, a couple big spikes of those incremental appropriations that have hit the door, that have now allowed for, you'll see the blue part, there's a cliff out there that's currently around a 2030 timeframe. That is what we project if we hit all of our numbers, which we won't, maybe to the good side, maybe to the bad side, but that we would expect that plan to be fully funded in the 2030, 2031 timeframe. And what that would mean when that plan becomes fully funded, that there would be no appropriations needed from the state of Indiana to fund this thing at that time. So we're on a trajectory in this plan to pay off the debt of that legacy pay-go plan. And get to a place where that is fully funded and self-sustainable going forward after the year 2030. These projections assume that the state continues to make its, I'll call it normal, 3% year-over-year appropriations growth into this fund until that date happens. The second biggest line item that we request from the General Assembly is funding for what is called the Local Public Safety Pension Relief Fund, or what we call pension relief. This is a fund that was set up, I forget exactly what year it was set up in, but as explained to me, there was a point in time during property tax reform where it was agreed that the state would pick up the liabilities for all of the old legacy local public safety plans that are out there. And so there's essentially, we are a funding mechanism, we're a pass-through. We tell the state, hey, here's how much we think we need to be able to cover all those obligations that the local units tell us. And then we pass that along and maintain kind of a small working balance in that account. So a couple headlines on this is that we have baked into the request holding flat the appropriation request of $152.5 million a year into this, which is flat to FY23. Maintains a modest balance. One of the things that we're monitoring closely in this account is what happens to wage inflation, because wage inflation is a component that goes into the benefits that these members receive, which aid into the balance a little bit, but we're forecasting that that isn't an ongoing permanent thing, but nonetheless was a factor, because if it weren't for that, you'd probably be seeing us asking for a little bit less in appropriations. In the middle of the page, you'll see right under deductions where it says pension relief distributions. This represents what goes out the door. You'll see that we peaked in 2022 and that number is starting to go down. So we anticipate a long gradual decline in how much local units will need to support this. This next slide gets into what's called the supplemental reserve accounts, SRAs. This was something that was the mechanism put back in place in 2018 that is meant to provide a funding source to provide for any what we call post-retirement benefit increases, also known as COLAs and 13th checks. And so this is, again, a number chart. And I would just essentially describe that effectively what takes place is we establish surcharge rates that the employers pay in to adequately fund a certain level of an increase. Now, what is that certain level? Well, that certain level is currently being driven and dictated because the funding source for teacher pre-96 COLAs and 13th checks is the $30 million of lottery revenue that comes to us. So that is currently, I'll call it the limiter as to what can be paid out to everybody else, because the policy thus far, right, is to treat all members of these funds the same when it comes to the level of a COLA and or a 13th check. So given with that limiter, then we kind of figure out how much do we need to collect from all the other funds to kind of be equal with how much is in the turf pre-96 to give a same level of benefit. And so that's what drives the surcharge rates that we charge into this plan. There's this concept of at any one given day, there's an amount of cash that sits in these accounts. But of that cash, there's a portion of it that has already been committed, particularly when it comes to COLA. So if you think of a COLA, you grant a COLA, that COLA is an ongoing increase for the retiree for as long as they live. The cash doesn't leave all at once. So what we do is we calculate how much still has to be in the account to cover what's already been promised in that COLA. So that represents the committed portion. And then what's uncommitted is what we call the leftover, and that's what's available for the General Assembly to grant in any additional increases. And so effectively, what I would say going into this session, you know, I know with inflation, cost of living is a very important topic to our retirees, particularly in PERF and TURF, that we believe that as currently funded, that there will be enough money in the SRAs to fund a traditional 13th check in each of the next 2 years. But no more. Inflation, just generally speaking about its impact on retirement plans, it's kind of a little bit of actually two-sided, at least a two-sided coin, and that coin kind of comes up heads or tails depending upon what time horizon you want to look at. Obviously, as people's wages go up, there's a component in many of our retirement plans where the benefit they get is based on their last years of salary. So there's a bump up as related to that. But really, when you think about the math, we collect a % of what they make. So as people make more, we collect more in dollars. However, there's the unfunded liability of what was already been earned, but we hadn't collected money for. So we have to make up for that. And so there is an impact in the contribution rate as wages impact unfunded liabilities. It also hits, there are some of our plans where there's an automatic COLA granted based on what happens with CPI, and there's a component to that. And then there's what inflation means to our investments. And again, this is a very complicated one I won't go into today, but it's an interesting one in that as inflation goes up, and if it were to stay up, that in some ways should be a help to our investment portfolio because many believe that the inflation is that base by which all other assets perform and sets the floor. And well, the floor's been dropped out for the last 10 years because of what the Fed has done with interest rates, which is why you see us and many others lowering our expectation for investment returns. But there's that hypothetical, maybe not so hypothetical out in the future, if we return to some normalcy in what interest rates are going forward, that actually might raise the floor a little bit. But right now, we don't see that raising of the floor yet because monetary policy, the Fed has been very adamant that they remain committed to a 2% inflation target. And so we're not going to fight them on that. We're going to take them at their word and assume that they'll be successful in that. So over the long haul, we still expect to see that lowered floor. That is the basis by which we still assume that 6.25% is the right number. I'll wrap up with my last slide, and that is an eye chart that kind of maybe mirrors a little bit what you would see in a Hyperion report. It breaks down by the different funds, what we have requested and would expect to get from the general fund. And then the second column, other, is just all those other funding sources that, depending upon the fund, could be lots and lots of different things. Generally speaking, in a normal year like in FY22, we had collected $1.7 billion from the general fund, but that did include that $545 million. We had this last year, or this current fiscal year, a big bump with that $2.5 billion. But what you'll see in FY24 and FY25 is, I'll call it more that traditional level of what would typically be funded for pensions. That is more in the area of $1.2 billion. I think that concludes my prepared remarks. I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Thanks, Steve. I have a question about the pre-96. So on one of your previous slides, it says there's a balance of $8.8 billion in unfunded liabilities. Does that take into consideration the 2.5? I didn't hear that.
It does not. So the
Because the 2.5 is not
8.8,
until 23. So
Correct.
technically, we would take the 2.5 off of that as well.
correct.
Okay. And I understand the 1 billion because that hasn't happened yet. And then a question on the supplemental reserve accounts. So you made a comment that you said there's enough to fund a 13th check for 2 years, but nothing more. What do you mean nothing more?
Well, I know there's been some discussions, as I hear from stakeholders, of a request for more than a traditional 13th check. I think there was a bill that was introduced in the last session that contemplated I think it was a $50 adder to that traditional level. And so anyway, that's the basis for which I make my comment.
Because I said when we set this account up, I didn't want to do a 13th check until it could pay for it. And because what I remember is they wanted a COLA, but because we could never afford a COLA, we did a 13th check. So it became an entitlement. It wasn't a guarantee, but because we did it so often, people just expect it. And so the last budget, what we did, since they cried for years to get a COLA, we give them that COLA. And then they go berserk because they didn't get a 13th check. So any fiscal person could tell you that that 1% COLA is worth much more money than a 1/13th check because the 1% is ongoing.
You're correct. And what I'll say is a couple comments on that. In aggregate, that is true. In fact, to make the COLA happen, and as I go out and talk to stakeholder groups and tell the story of, in my opinion, the great things that are happening here to fund their pension, is a reminder that the cost of that COLA that was done last time was actually more than a 13th check. The fact that you had to appropriate an additional $50 million to be able to make that COLA happen. So in aggregate, the COLA was worth more than a traditional 13th check. However, you have, I'll call it winners and losers of that 13th check, because for somebody who's collecting a very small retirement benefit, that 13th check is, as a percentage, really important to them. And if, say you're 85 years old and only collecting a couple $100 a month, right? That 13th check was their Christmas money maybe, or whatever that was, right? And so for them, they're, they just saw that 1%. So you have different segments. For those that are recently retired, higher up in the wage and the level of the benefit, they come out ahead. And so I think that's the source of some of the angst that you might be hearing from stakeholders, in that you have some at the very lower end who feel that they were disproportionately impacted by the COLA versus a 13th check.
Well, I try to tell them the issue is the fact that pre-96 isn't funded. So the other funds pay for the 13th check, but the state has to appropriate out of the general fund the 13th check for the pre-96. So years ago, we thought, let's look into the idea, we give a 13th check to those because it's out of their fund, to those that have a fund, but don't do the 13th check for the pre-96 because there's no fund. At that point in time, we were told that if you do one, you have to do it for all of them. So my issue has been appropriating money out of the general fund for the 13th check. If you're telling me that there's enough in here for a 13th check and everybody gripes about a COLA, then we could do a 13th check with no current dollars, with no additional money, with what's in the retirement account or the reserve account.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Oh, I do have one other thing to say. So the page before that, I don't know, it says you demand, is that you?
So I apologize. For those in the audience, there was a printer setting that when these were printed out, our notes column, our notes page, so some of you that have the hard copies are seeing inside, behind the curtains of NPERS, and comments going back and forth. And one that you're seeing, you demand, is our actuary, Handy Blau, and he is demand. He's awesome. We love him. And
Figured we weren't supposed to see that, so shout out to
No,
Danny
you weren't supposed to
then.
get that,
Thank
so.
you. Any questions? Senator Brown.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Quickly, so if we pay the additional $1 billion that had been contemplated, we are contemplating having the teachers fund fully funded before 2030 then?
we estimate, all things, hitting all of our assumptions, that extra $1 billion would pull up the fully funded by about 1 year.
Okay. And then with respect to the COLA versus 13th check, which gave me angst that you even said that, but what would it look like in this coming year? Because as I recall, there's a point where the COLA does, if we were able to do that in the teachers, start to surpass what the 13th check dollar amount looks like, right? The COLA would be higher.
Yes, I think.
And
that
what
is
year
that.
would that be?
Oh, that is out there, I think, in the 2030s.
Not until the 2030s?
Yeah, and I want to be sure I'm understanding your correction, because there's a lot of dynamics
If
that
we
go
gave
into
a COLA instead of a 13th check, not in the other accounts, but in the teachers, when does the COLA become higher than the 13th check?
Well, I'm not sure that it does. I think
Because the
What-
13th check is flat, I
the
thought.
13th check is flat for everybody. And so what you'll see in the math is that when this thing was set up, it's being funded by the actuaries, assuming an average COLA.
Oh, okay.
Okay, that's the basis by which they do the math as the baseline. And what you'll find is, right, the 13th check is a fixed amount. On average, teachers have a higher retirement benefit than PERF. So a 13th check on a percentage basis is, I'll call it better for PERF, the average PERF member, than it is for the average TURF member, because it's a fixed dollar amount, not a percentage of what they receive in a benefit.
Interesting. Okay, and then the last one, for the judges, prosecutors, and legislators, is there, or maybe in all of the plans, are there different matches with respect to the employee versus the employer's contribution to the plan?
Yes.
And what are the differences in all of those?
Well, so, going through each one, generally speaking, for a number of those plans, there's a 6% contribution that the members make, in addition to what the employer has to pay in and what we ask the legislature to appropriate. Those smaller plans are funded. Our actuaries do a forecast of what we think the contributions are needed for that plan, and instead of collecting it as a percent of their payroll, we just make it a fixed dollar amount that we come and ask the General Assembly to do as part of the appropriations.
Okay, but can you share that information with me to
Yes,
see
yeah.
the difference?
We'll get you
Because some I
summaries of-
know have been, it is I've been told there's some are more generous than others, and I'd like to see what the percentage is and how that plays out. And congratulations for being number one. Who was last?
Oh, in which contest?
Well, whatever one you mentioned. That you
Oh, well, the one that we won was the actuarial funding contest. They didn't announce who the losers were. But in number one, I thought you were mentioning, just a quick shout out operationally, we were recognized again. There's a global benchmarking firm, CEM, that benchmarks our service and the cost and the money we spend to deliver that service. They do this globally across all the pension funds that participate. We were number one in the world in service. Now I think 2 going on 3 years in a row. And we are in what I call it the top quadrant of the cost per member while also delivering that. There's nobody else that we're aware of in the world that delivers a higher level of service for the money that we spend.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chair.
Senator Gador?
First, thank you for your service over here. Thank you for your service. This is an important work that you do for you and your team. I have 2 short questions. The first, if you look at that public safety pension, and this might be more for my colleagues, I don't know, I'm new here, I've been here for 2 years, so I don't know what the legislative history is, but if we're funding using the lottery and cigarettes and alcohol tax and transfers, and those revenue sources tend to fluctuate, if we're committed to that pension anyways, why not fund all of it through just the general fund and make these 3 other categories just be deposited in the general fund? And that's just a technical question. I don't know what the legislative history is.
I wish I was in a position to explain why the funding mechanisms were set the way they are. I just candidly don't know what the history of why things from the different buckets.
Just semantically and symbolically, not from a policy perspective, I just get nervous when we use things such as, things fluctuating, things like gambling or lottery, taxes to fund a system that we needed to stabilize. So just it's symbolic and semantics to me on this one. My second and final question. So part of, I think the rate for the traditional perf plan currently is the 11.2.
Correct.
How much is the unfunded liability portion? Is it 3.1 or what is the unfunded liability portion of the 11.2?
The unfunded liability in perf today is $2.7 billion.
And the purpose of the unfunded liability percentage is to ensure that the pension system is stabilized across the board. Is that correct?
Yes, it's a mechanism that's intended to, one, properly fund the plan first and foremost, and then bring a level of stability to the contribution rate that employers pay so that it isn't bumping up and down from one year to the next.
Excellent. I just wanted to confirm that before I ask the question. So my question is, many local units contribute on behalf of employees who never get vested in the system, and unfortunately, they pass away. Do you have any idea of, over the last 10, 20, 30 years, how much local units contributed to the pension plan for employees that never got vested and they passed away? And the reason that I emphasize the point about passing away, because I can see someone who might disengage from public service, they might come back in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. So I understand why we wouldn't refund those dollars. I asked the first question about the unfunded liability because that's the portion of the 11.2 that helps us stabilize the system. So my argument is there a fairness case to be made that for those who never get vested and pass away, doesn't that money belong back to the local units? Because, so I'm not sure if any discussions.
No, that's a great question, and I would say the answer, actually, it does go back to them because the actuaries make assumptions on all of that.
So the reduction of a future rate could potentially incorporate those dollars. Is that documented and systematically applied through the actuarial work to say,
yes,
God forbid 10,000 people over the last 30 years passed away, they never got vested, here's the amount of dollars, and let's incorporate that in our future calculations?
Well, I don't know how granular it gets to exactly how you just described it, but I can tell you that the actuaries make assumptions and they validate those assumptions every 5 years looking back at actually what happened. And for example, I'm a round ball here, in perf and turf, only 1 out of 3 people who enter the plan end up vesting after 10 years. Now, depending upon how you look at that, that might be a bad thing, but from a dollars perspective, the actuaries know that, and they bake that into how much they're charging employers to support that plan, right? So as that assumption changes, that might change the contribution rate. So employers are getting the benefit or the hurt, depending upon all of those things that you just talked about, whether they died before they should have or shouldn't have. One of dozens and dozens of assumptions that the actuaries make that are completely fully disclosed in our reports that I can get you a copy of that looks plan by plan across all of those assumptions.
I appreciate it. I just want to comment. I want to thank you about the clarity of your explanation of the impact of the 13th check versus the COLA. That was a healthy debate that we had last session. I see both policy proposals, but I'm optimistic based on what you explained today that there could be an opportunity in the next session to fund the 13th check, given the explanation that you offered today. So I appreciate you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I've heard a lot about fees and dedicated funds fluctuating. And we have to keep in mind that the general fund's not a sure thing. You know, those funds fluctuate too. You know, sales tax fluctuates every month, personal income tax, corporate income tax. So it's not just the fees and the dedicated funds that fluctuate, and then, you know, everyone wants to turn to the general fund, but that revenue stream fluctuates too. So it really doesn't matter. So I just want to clarify, because I've heard it 2 or 3 times today. Representative Porter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Russo. I just have a couple of questions. I was asked this earlier in regards to, we have $42.2 billion that we're looking at, and InPurse is the managing responsibility for those investments. Those investments, and you did mention one company, what about the diversity inclusion of other money managers? Is that part of your initiatives? If they are, I've asked this before, never got a really straight answer in regards to that, and that's a concern of mine.
So what I did include in the packet was in our PMOC presentation. Happy to get you an update of, we do track what we call our minority women business-owned managers that meet certain criteria of how much we have invested in those types of money managers. It is off the top of my head and close to, I'll call it the 10%, 9-10% range. It's historically stayed in that range. Now, we do not target, and we are fiduciaries, and we have and will continue to make and invest in those managers that we think deliver the best rate, risk-adjusted rate of return to our members, period, whoever they are, unless you have told us in law that we can't. That's our fiduciary duty. We're legally bound to do that. So we're mindful. We continue to seek and look for qualified minority women business-owned managers. I wish there was more of them. We have a number of things that we try to do into the community through some great partners that we have to try to get children that are in our schools interested in these types of careers. And because I'm of the opinion that really takes getting down to that grassroots roots there at the K through 12, getting those minority women business oriented folks into the financial investment community. Obviously, STEM is a big part in that area, but again, we're doing what we can. But again, we don't have a specific program where we're purposely setting aside money for those or any other types of managers.
Thank you. Very interesting comments you just made. First of all, it seemed like that portion is on the back burner, so it wasn't in your presentation. I think it's important as citizens of this community throughout that it is important, and that you, I understand about return on investment and making money and doing the best you can, but I think, inclusion is very important, and it should, even try to help grow our own and give people that opportunity. To me, it's important, and I don't know the dynamics of your team, but maybe your team need a little education also. In regards, and I appreciate the COLA conversation, good news that we can do it for the next couple of years. But I've been around a little bit. So what would be the dollar amount of the COLA for the next 2 years? And because, I thought it was tiered, that it depended in regards to that. And you said everyone gets the same, but I thought it depended on your retirement level
No, I appreciate the question.
in years
and
of
thanks for the-
service. So
Yeah.
I don't understand that. I mean, that's,
Yeah, let me clarify. Let me
because
clarify that
that's what
remark.
you said.
Right, so when I meant equal, the equality is about treating members of the different funds equally in terms of what they get. Now, when it comes to what they actually get in a traditional 13th check, the amount ranges from, traditionally, it's ranged from $150 for those with between 0 and 10 years of service, and it steps up to a maximum of $450 for those that achieve 30 years of service.
Representative Delaney?
Yeah, just a couple of questions. What is the current payout on the pre-1996 teacher pension? How many dollars a year are we paying for the actual benefits in a year?
The payout, let me get to one slide
I'm
that's
looking at
not
the hump
included here.
chart, and the hump chart's kind of generalized.
Yeah, it's, I want to say it's about $2 billion, if that helps, if you're looking for just
Approximately
around.
$2 billion? Okay.
Appreciate your patience. If you have another question and
Yeah,
want to
yeah, well,
keep
I mean,
going, why? you can
Yeah, if
verify
we,
the
if we
number I
look
just
at
gave
the
you.
chart that you do have about funded status, if we added the $2.5 billion additional that was put into the pre-96 fund, we'd be about $7.8 billion in what I'm going to call a reserve. Is that a fair term for it?
I'll just call it a pay down of a debt, unfunded liability that is there. And so to answer your first question,
Right.
Representative Delaney, and I was off by a factor of $1 billion, it's about $1.2 billion.
Okay.
That goes up.
That's what I kind of thought it was like. All right, so we're paying out $1.2 billion, and that number is going to go down every year because of the age of the participants.
That's what we forecast.
So it's going to drop, okay. So if we then go back and we're paying 1.2, which is a quote high number because it's going to fall, and we have 7.8 in pre-funded, this will sound like terrible economics, but it's right. We could go 5 or 6 years, not put a penny in an appropriation, and we could pay those people for that 5 or 6 years.
I would say in any pension fund, right, if the idea is to only pay benefits when they become due, which makes
Right.
a plan 0%
Right,
funded.
right.
I mean, yeah, there's cash to do
Right,
that.
right, right.
You know, would the world view that as a proper way to
Exactly.
to fund a pension?
That's why my preface was there. But what I'm saying is we have a very substantial reserve against that future liability. We have an amount of pay about $1.2 billion, but that number is going to go down. Is that fair to say?
The $1.2 billion number
It's going
will
down,
go
right. And
down.
so, as I hear you, we're maybe going to get through this unfunded status in 2029, which is 6 or 7 years out. What did we think 5 or 10 years ago? When did we think at that point we would pay it off? Because I have the sense from being in the legislature that I was looking at 2035, 2040 as an end this unfunded liability, but now I'm looking at 2029. Do you have any recall as to what our expectations was 5 or 10 years ago?
Yeah, well, I mean, expectations of this have changed quite a bit since the,
Right.
I'll go back to the inception of it. You know, from the best I could tell of pension history, you know, the Pension Stabilization Fund was established to mitigate the impact of the baby boomers coming through. And I think I sat in this room maybe almost 15 years ago with a slide that projected out, right, that there would be a need for ongoing contributions until the last person died in that plan. But what was happened through a series of decisions made by policymakers was, right, to want to get that debt paid off.
Right.
And so there's been activity to do that, and that's what you see now baked into the numbers you see.
Thank you. And yeah, I'm patting you and us on the back for doing that. I think it's been very positive. Thank you.
I just want to clarify something. So you said the 1.2 billion goes down, but we actually increase it 3% every year. So I wanted to clarify, because it was $1 billion, then we go up 3%, so now we're up to 1.2, it'll go up 3%. So traditionally, in the budget, we've raised it 3% a year.
Correct?
Okay.
And just to put the numbers in perspective, and I have the exact numbers here, so as we forecast out, for example, the benefit payments in FY '24 forecasted to be right at 1.2 billion. But I believe what we've asked for and what's baked in for the general fund is just a little over $1 billion. So there's still less being appropriated in paying out. But that goes back to what I was talking about earlier, that mechanism of knowing that, at least going in, that there was going to be a period where there would be less appropriations than benefits, and that money would have to come out of the pension stabilization fund.
Any other questions? All right, thank you for your work.
Very welcome, thank you.
Next, we have Finance Authority, Dan Hughey and Jim McGough.
Thank you, Mike. I know I'm the only thing standing between you guys and lunch, so I appreciate your time. And as I go through the slide deck, if you got questions, please feel free to jump in as you'd like. I know we have a few new members, so what we're going to try to do here is go through our debt management overview first, then go through our appropriation-backed debt, and then go through our non-appropriated backed debt, and then talk a little bit about our environmental program, specifically our brownfields program. History lesson for the new members. 2005, the General Assembly created the Indiana Finance Authority to oversee state debt-related items. They originally started with rolling in the Indiana Transportation Finance Authority, the Indiana Office Building Commission, and the Indiana Recreational Development Commission. All those entities in blue issue appropriation-backed debt. The State Revolving Fund, which issues all of the bonds for our clean water and clean sewer that are backed with EPA funds also. And the Indiana Development Finance Authority, and then the Indiana Health and Educational Finance Authority. Those are all in brown. The debt they issue is non-appropriation backed debt. It has revenues to support the debt. So we issue debt on behalf of all these predecessor agencies and have managed their portfolio since '05. We also issue debt for special projects, Stadium Convention Center, Indiana State Fair Coliseum, and the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. During the 2005 session, the Public Finance Director was given the statutory oversight of all state debt issuance as the Chief Executive Officer of the Indiana Finance Authority. Pursuant to that authorization, the Public Finance Director has the following additional responsibilities: board member of the Indiana Bond Bank and the Indiana Housing Community Development Authority, involved in the approval process for public university debt, involved in all debt issuances or informed of all debt issuance for the State Fair, the Ports of Indiana, and the Indiana Secondary Market for Educational Loans, also known as InvestEd. The ability of the Public Finance Director to monitor all the debt being issued by the state issuers enables consistent debt management across the state. In the past, you had those 6 authorities issuing debt somewhat on their own, each of them kind of interacting with the rating agencies in the capital markets on their own, and now we have one Oracle doing that. The final bullet there is the Public Finance Director is responsible for communication with rating agencies related to the state's credit rating. It's good to have one voice to those rating agencies that they know they can pick up the phone and call. The rating agencies now will call us even on some local government issues, wanting to get some input who they need to talk to. So we've developed a very strong relationship with all 3 rating agencies. A little bit of history on our current ratings. Standard & Poor's since 2008 has us rated AAA. Moody's since 2010, AAA. And Fitch at the same time, AAA. The main things we see quoted in the rating agency reports are strong budgetary reserves, financial management and oversight, strong liquidity, low leverage of debt and pension, conservative management, fiscal management, and strong fiscal higher flexibility. We also have a low cost of living and a business-friendly legislative body, low long-term liability burden, and a strong operating profile. And that is reflected in the reports we get back from all three of them, who update our profile annually. I'd like to, this is a slide we added, I think, last year or the year before. It kind of gives you a snapshot. Moody's every year puts out what they call a debt median report, where it does a number of calculations, but the key ones we look at each year is, debt per capita is one of the bigger ones, and you'll see there in the top upper quadrant to the left in September 2022, our debt per capita was $217 per person. In the previous year was $233. We've actually now moved to the fifth lowest position in debt per capita, debt as part of our state GDP, and debt as part of our personal income. And you'll see the number of about $1.5 million up there is our net tax supported debt. They look at our debt portfolio and only look at the debt we have outstanding that directly has appropriation to pay it back. There are some other bonds we have outstanding that do have an appropriation backstop but have revenues that come in to cover the debt service annually. So it's not part of what we call our net tax supported debt with the rating agencies. That's why our number is significantly low. Go through a quick profile of our appropriation backed debt. We have the Transportation Finance Authority, which is NDOT, approximately $500 million remaining outstanding. The Public University Fee Replace debt, which is about $1.2 billion. I think they were all presenting yesterday. The Stadium and Convention Center Authority, which is Lucas Oil Stadium, and in the addition to the Convention Center, about $935 million. State Office Building Commission, about $129 million. The Indiana Bond Bank has some moral obligation debt outstanding of about $90 million. I have a separate slide on the bond bank. I'll explain the moral obligation in that slide. Indianapolis Motor Speedway, about $71 million. And then we have a loan related to our East End Crossing Bridge, or more commonly known as the Ohio River Bridge, of about $109 million. So total appropriation backed is a little over $3 billion. We do have an oversight. Again, it was lined up by the General Assembly. The Transportation Authority now gets issued through the IFA. Public universities do, when they want to issue new debt, they do send us what they're going to do. Mark Pasquarella, our debt director, where he at in the back, works with those universities, reviews what they're going to want to do. We review it, and then it goes to budget to look at, and then it ultimately comes to, State Budget Committee to give a final sign off. And we have a really strong relationship with those universities. IU was just in last week to kind of give us an update on their debt portfolio and proposed capital projects and ideas how they may fund them. Other universities do the same with us. We have the Stadium Convention Center, again, issued by the IFA under our control. State Office Building, issued by the IFA. The Indiana Bond Bank, we get IFA, the Public Finance Director is a board member, but anything the Indiana Bond Bank does, really done a moral obligation bond, has to go in front of Budget Committee for a review. And then the Recreational Development Authority is also now under the Indiana Finance Authority. To look at debt portfolio by those different quadrants, we issued debt for the Indiana Transportation Finance Authority, basically NDOT. Right now, we have about $510 million of NDOT debt outstanding. We have not issued any new debt for NDOT since 2004. The payment is made on for highway and bridge bonds. It's primarily from our gas tax. It is 100% fixed rate. And we did defease about $150 million of debt related to the 2017 highway refunding bonds. Those were the bonds we had to issue when we had to unwind our I-69 Section 5 public-private partnership. That helped reduce the amount of NDOT debt we have outstanding. We're right now paying down NDOT debt to the tune of about $65 to $80 million a year. And I believe our final maturity of NDOT debt is 2030. So that will be done soon. And to give you a perspective on NDOT, previous year, it was about $723 million to where we're at now to 510. Quick slide on the fee replacement, give you a quick snapshot of the various universities and what they have outstanding. These bonds are debt issued by the universities through which state appropriations reimburses the university for the debt service. Again, I'd already touched on it, has to come to Budget Committee for review and approval of Budget Director and Public Finance Director. This debt outstanding, based upon our conversations, will probably continue to grow over the next year based upon authorization of new projects that have yet to be financed. Again, IU at about $289 million Ivy Tech, 210 million. Purdue, 274 million. Ball State, 210. USI, 105. Indiana State, 102. And Vincennes, 27, to total about 1.2 billion. Stadium Convention Center portfolio is managed by the IFA. This is a really good story. When these bonds were really originally issued between, I think, 2007 and 2011, almost 79% of them were either variable rate debt or hedged with an interest rate swap. So we were subject to the volatility of variable rate debt in the markets. Through strategic refunding, the portfolio is now completely 100% fixed rate. And we've reduced all of our risk on that portfolio. Especially, we were thankful we refunded the last portion in March, and thankfully did that before we saw rates really start going up on us. It also gives us call provisions on these bonds now, and a number of them in 2025. So we have the ability to pay these down not too far in the future if we have additional revenue or a decision made to pay these bonds down further. We have never used an appropriation to make a debt service on the Stadium Convention Center bonds. The revenues that are coming in have been more than enough. It's generally what you'd expect on something like this: food and beverage tax, hotel motel tax, rental car, admissions tax, and even the Colts license plate fee each year helps pay the bonds on this. State Office Building Commission, again, covered by the IFA. We do issue on behalf of the Department of Administration, Family Social Services, and Department of Corrections. This is all 100% fixed rate and not too much left. I will tell you these energy saving leases we have with Department of Corrections, about 3.8 million, will be paid off in early 2024, so those will be going away. The Neurodiagnostic Institute bonds is the main one we still have outstanding of $125 million. In the past few years, since June of 2021, we've either defeased or paid off because they matured Wabash Correctional, Newcastle Correctional, Madison State Hospital, Logansport State Hospital, and Evansville State Hospital. We had talked about the Indiana Bond Bank earlier. Indiana Bond Bank provides assistance to local governments in funding special projects through the use of bonds, including water and sewer and capital projects. The IBB special program debt may form a moral obligation with the state of Indiana, provided the issuing organization with more favorable financing terms. What the bond bank can utilize with the moral obligation debt is if you have an entity that is either unrated or lowly rated that needs to do a project, they can go to the bond bank and request to issue debt using the state's moral ob to get a AA rate on the debt. I can tell you this, that no moral obligation debt has been issued by the bond bank since 2010. There has never been a moral obligation used or called upon on any of the bond bank debt that's outstanding, which shows the belt and suspenders they put around those moral obligation bonds that have been issued. There is a list of the bonds they currently have outstanding. I believe, and when I looked at their last debt portfolio, all the moral obligation bonds would be paid off by 2030. Generally, the portfolio is dropping by about $15 million a year. Each year, the entities continue to pay down their debt. Not part of our net tax supported debt. The rating agency does kind of look at it as a contingent liability, but right now it does not affect our credit rating whatsoever. We do have a public-private partnership. We call it technically it's the East End Crossing Bridge down between Louisville and Jeffersonville, also known as the Ohio River Bridge. It was a full-blown P3 design, build, finance, operate, maintain. We provided two types of payments during this process. During the construction period, the IFA and INDOT provided milestone payments to cover some of the construction costs for the developer. And we now make an availability payment monthly as the road is open for business and being maintained appropriately. We do monitor the road's quality and other things. If there are problems, we can reduce the availability payment we are making to the developer. We also did a small bond through the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, TIFIA, which was a subsidized rate to help us make some of those milestone payments in the early years during construction. And then the developer early on in this project, issued what they called private activity bonds. This was bonds they were able to issue on a tax-exempt basis through the IFA, fully on the credits of the developer, not the state of Indiana. And those bonds right now are about $527 million. They did refund those bonds last year, got savings. The way our agreement was written, any savings when they refund bonds, the state is to receive half of those savings. So our availability payment actually, I believe, drops by about $750,000 a year because of the refunding they did. It's been a good partnership with them. They've been in contact with us. They give us regular updates. Real quick slide on the non-appropriation backed debt. The bond bank does have other debt they issue that does not have the moral obligation on it. Our state revolving fund for our environmental programs, mainly clean water, clean sewer, has about $1.9 billion of debt outstanding. The Indiana secondary market for educational loans, InvestEd, currently has about $76 million. These are old federal loans. They had helped students with and issued bonds for, I think, a while ago. And I think in 2012, the federal government changed who could assist with federally backed student loans. So this is just what's remaining of InvestEd's federal loan portfolio. We've talked about the university fee replacements. And then the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority. Also, all the bonds they issue are backed by the developers or other clients that are issuing bonds through them. Our oversight of the non-appropriation backed debt, I think we've covered a lot of it. The IFA, the Public Finance Director, is on the board of the bond bank. State revolving fund, we already issue. Indiana secondary market for educational loans, they are to give us, discuss with us when they're going to do a bond issue and bring us into the loop. Same would be true for the ports of Indiana. They're supposed to give us an update prior to any issuing of debt. And Indiana State Fair Commission, they would work through us. And Housing and Community Development Authority, we also sit on their board, so we were able to monitor all of their activities. So all in, I think we do a good job of making sure we're monitoring any of the debt that's going out into the market, be it appropriation-backed or non-appropriation-backed debt. I think we're definitely on the hawkish on the oversight. Last slide just gives you an update on our brownfields program, on our petroleum orphan site initiative. The purpose, it addresses petroleum contaminant on brownfield sites resulting from leaking underground storage tanks that cannot be addressed by a responsible party due to inability to pay, bankruptcy, et cetera. This program has been funded since, it would be getting appropriation dollars since 2014. All the funding comes from IDEM's Excess Liability Trust Fund and reimbursements from IDEM's Petroleum Trust Fund, about $970,000 annually. For the last budget cycle, we requested $2.5 million per year from this excess liability funds, and all those funds were allocated to projects. A nice summary of all the things the Brownfield program has done in that next bullet point. I'm not going to go through all of those, but we do make a difference out there. Our team, our Brownfields team is active in helping. They get called in on a lot of projects that are pretty difficult from a cleanup perspective, and they do a great job. Our request this year for 2024, 2025 is slightly up, $4 million a year. We continue to see requests above what we can currently handle. They've already communicated with IDEM, and they are happy to give us the additional money out of their excess liability trust fund because we do work together really well. So I know I went through that quickly, so glad to answer any questions.
Dan, can you go back to the brownfields here? And so I'm going back in time. So those that had pumps had to pay into that fund. And we made adjustments to the fund several years ago, because I mean, people came in front of us and said, oh, we don't need all that money anymore. And I can't remember if we lowered what they paid in, or did we say they didn't have to pay in anymore? I can't remember.
I'm going to bring up the expert to
Okay.
answer that one. I know when I don't know what I don't know.
Okay.
Thank you, Jim McGough. And that, I think IDEM will be here this afternoon, and that would be a good question for them. We do not manage the Excess Liability Trust Fund. It just, that is the source of the transfers that come to our program. But yeah, that program is managed by IDEM.
But in here, you're saying you need more money, and that comes out of the fund though, right?
Correct, yes.
So that's my concern. If I was told years ago we didn't need the fund, and now all of a sudden we need more money, obviously somebody was wrong. before. So I guess that's an item question since they do the fund. So I'll ask them that
Right,
question.
and our discussions with them about increasing the amount from 2.5 to 4 included, can the fund support it, and was answered with yes. So, but Brian, he can address it in more details.
So you're saying they're still paying in enough to cover the fund?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
That's what concerned me a little
Yep.
bit. I
Yeah,
thought we'd have to add to the fund to
No.
transfer the money to you.
No, the
The
core,
money's in, you just want a bigger transfer.
yep, the core function of the fund is being satisfied.
Okay. Questions? Representative Porter?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What about the federal gas tax in regards to what Senator was talking about? You know, we get, is it 18 point something %?
Oh, you're talking about this federal gas tax?
Right, in regards to the brownfields.
Transportation, yeah.
And that's constant. We get
Correct.
1 cent. So, 1.1 cent, right?
Correct.
Okay. So we do get something from that.
Yeah, that would be a question for NDOT, who's after lunch, but I believe that's correct.
Okay, well, this is my appetizer before lunch.
That's,
Okay.
I'm glad to be an appetizer, Representative Porter.
And also, I had written down, you said by 2024, the obligations for the DLC will be paid for?
Which one again, sorry?
DLC, the obligations for DLC will be paid for?
Correct.
By 2024. So yesterday, I think we looked at something for about, how much would a bonding cost for like $1.2 billion? If we bond that, how much would that cost?
Well, I figured this might happen. I did run an analysis of current market conditions, a $100 million bond issue. Annual debt service would be about let's just say 8.5 million. So if you take that 8.5, multiply it by 12, that's going to be your annual debt service. Good job. I didn't have a calculator in front of me. So yeah, and again, that was rates as of about a week ago. I ran that thinking that question might come up today.
Any other questions? All right.
Thank you.
You guys back on track by 10 minutes. So it is actually 12:20, so we'll reconvene at, we'll just make it a half hour, at 1:30.